so I'm busy finalizing my PhD, and this in short is what it's about. It's about Jimmy Carter, who stands as an exception in U.S. history because he put the Palestinian issue as the most important issue in solving the Arab-Israeli conflict. So in a sense, he shifted, this might be an exaggeration, but in a sense, he shifted the conflict from being an Arab-Israeli conflict to being a Palestinian-Israeli conflict, with an Arab-Israeli conflict sort of outside it. And today I'm going to talk about how he comes in with that sort of idea and how he leaves office basically having failed. So let's start with the Carter legacy. Now, Carter is remembered very often as sort of a failed president. And in the Middle East, his reputation is rather mixed. He failed to keep the Shah in power, which from a U.S. perspective was, a huge error, because the Shah was the most stable ally, one of the two pillars of U.S. Middle East policy, together with Saudi Arabia. And that basically fell apart on his guard. He had the Iranian hostage crisis. He had the second oil crisis. But in terms of success, he negotiated the Camp David Accords and later the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. But what I've been focusing on is sort of, I would argue, one of the most important aspects of Carter's Middle East legacy, but it's one that's almost completely ignored. And that is the fact that he put the Palestinian issue to the forefront. Now, this aspect is ignored for the very obvious reason that he failed. But the other reason is because it doesn't quite fit with a very nice narrative. Now, this very nice narrative is negative when portraying America, but it goes that the U.S. wanted to divide the Arab world, take Egypt out of the conflict, make things easier for Israel, sort of solve half of the conflict, bring Egypt into a U.S. alliance, and ensure that Israel would never have to face sort of the united Arab world again in war. Now, while this is true in the sense that that was the result of Carter's policy, it is false in that it was the intention. So what I'm going to talk about today is not the result of Carter, but the intentions behind Carter's policy. And the reason I find this to be so extremely important is because what we can call Carter's Palestine moment is a failed moment in U.S. Middle East policy. If it had succeeded, things would have been very different. This was the moment where they could have started talking to the PLO 15 years ahead of time. And this was the moment where the Palestinian issue could have been part of the political process rather than being postponed and postponed and postponed and everything that happened since. So basically what I've done is I've gone primarily to the Carter archives, and I've gone through those systematically over 4 years with thousands of archival pages of the internal debates, the internal decision making, what they talked about between the diplomats. I mean, when Israel and the Arabs weren't listening, and there it's very, very clear that the Palestinian issue was one of the most important issues, right? They wanted to talk to the PLO, but they didn't manage to. So the question is, why weren't they able to do it? The U.S. is the most powerful nation on earth, and they, could have taken the decision, let's talk to the PLO. It would have made sense. You want a solution to the Palestinian issue, the PLO are the people to talk to, but they didn't do that. So that's one of the main questions here. Why did they not talk to the PLO? Now, before we start with Carter, let's take a historical step back. We have to understand the political context of which Carter comes into power. Prior to 1967, the Palestinians had been treated primarily as a refugee problem. In other words, a humanitarian issue to be treated in a humanitarian sense, or as sort of an extra political issue to be treated by others, right? So their role as a political party in the talks was not taken seriously. Not by the United States, not by Israel, and not by the Arab states. To quote Karl Marx, they cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. And as Martha Hayan Engdahl, who previously held a lecture at the Sims Lecture Series last year, the Palestinians were not even invited to negotiate how to handle their own refugee crisis. So even in their very specific issues, the right of return, how to treat the Palestinian villages, etc., they were not at the table. So it was, the Arabs who talked on their behalf. Now, this lack of engagement with the Palestinians is particularly reflected in United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, which is the benchmark of all peace negotiations. Now, the only thing in this resolution, it's a short resolution, but it's the alpha and omega of peace talks. The only thing in it referring to Palestinians is point 2b, for achieving a just settlement to the refugee problem. That's it. Everything else in the resolution talks about states, talks about Israeli withdrawal without specifying all of the territories. So it's not a Palestinian territory they must withdraw from. It's the states in the region. So it's Israel, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, not the Palestinians. So that's the first thing to notice. They're not mentioned as an actor, and they're grouped in the very vague term refugees, right? So it's not Palestinian refugees, it's just refugees, which could be also, other groups, right? So they're not a national group, and they're not the only refugees either. So this is the 1967 context. They are refugees, that's it. And this meant that the PLO could not recognize United Nations Resolution 242 because it did not recognize them. They were not a party to the conflict. But since everybody accepted that this was the benchmark on how to negotiate, the Palestinians were out. So there was no framework for them to join the negotiations. And second of all, accepting Resolution 242 would have implied accepting Israel. Now, the second paradox here is that once the Palestinians, as a result of the 1967 war, started to take matters into their own hands, because prior to 1967, they'd been sort of part of the Arabist movement, right? So it was Nasser or King Hussein or et cetera, who would represent them. And a lot of the Palestinians sort of accepted that premise because there was a broader Arabist movement. But around 1967, this changed. So the PLO, with the rise of Fatah and Yasser Arafat, decided that it was a nationalist struggle with an aim to liberate Palestine by the Palestinians for the Palestinians. And this is a very dramatic shift, right? So this transformation had some huge complications that followed. Because how do you sort of take matters into your own hand when you're sort of a byproduct of a conflict? Now, there were various approaches, and it's a very complicated history, and I just don't have time to go into it. But the Palestinian nationalist movement in this period became most famous for its terrorist attacks. Whether it's the 1970 hijackings or the München massacre at the Olympics, etc., this is what they became famous for. So what happens is basically this terrorism, but also, I mean, they did a lot of other political things. But it was the terrorism that really made them recognized as a political group, but it also made them vilified. So people saw that they were there, but this did not transform into them being accepted, right? So they're still excluded. They go from being refugees, which is a humanitarian issue, to being terrorists, which is a security issue. It's not a negotiation type issue. But in the early 1970s, the PLO starts to shift. Because part of this prior movement had also been to liberate all of historical Palestine. But in the mid-1970s, early to mid-1970s, the PLO started shifting in a moderating direction. In 1972, PFLP, which is one of the left-wing groups within the PLO, declares to end so-called external operations, which is nomenclature for basically terrorism on foreign soil. In 1974, Fatah does the same. And in 1974, the PLO opens up for the possibility of a two-state solution in a very vague terminology, in a so-called 10-point program, which says that they could establish a national authority on the liberated parts of Palestine. It's very vague, and there are other parts of this declaration that says, we want to liberate all of Palestine. But it's a shift. It's the first major shift in that direction. And in 1977, the PLO went a little bit further, but not explicitly in that direction, but that's sort of the trend. And the PLO are basically crowned with victory for this moderating stance in the Arab world and in the international community, but not in the United States. So in 1974, the Arab League Rabat Summit says that the PLO are the sole representative of the Palestinian people. So it's no longer the Arab states that will represent the Palestinians, but the Palestinians that will represent themselves. Now, obviously, we can go into the whole, discussion of whether they really meant that and the degree to which they were allowed to be autonomous by the other Arab heads of state. But anyway, the political statement is there. And that's what really matters in terms of the global community recognizing that they are a political entity. And in 1974, Arafat speaks at the United Nations. And later the same year, PLO gains observer status in the United Nations General Assembly. So the PLO is having this massive success in the United Nations General Assembly, here by Arafat speaking, but this does not transform into a US recognition of the same issue. So what is happening at the same time as the PLO is coming to the forefront as a national movement accepted by the global community, and certainly within the Arab world, the US is negotiating between states. So after the 1973 war, the negotiations are between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Syria. And these result in so-called disengagement plans. So you have minor withdrawal for, it's called minor peace. Not full peace and not full withdrawal. It's sort of a step on the way. And this is Kissinger's so-called step-by-step diplomacy. Partition the whole conflict into its minor parts and solve them piecemeal. Solve a little bit here, solve a little bit there. And basically exclude the Palestinians. And the most important document excluding the Palestinians is the Sinai II secret promise to Israel. And in this secret promise to Israel, Kissinger basically says that the United States will not recognize or negotiate with the PLO so long as the PLO does not recognize Israel's right to exist and does not accept UN Security Council resolutions 242 and 338. Now, 338 is basically just a reaffirmation of 242. So it's the same thing, but with the 1973 war context instead of the 67 war context. Now, this pledge was not intended as strictly as Carter read it, because it's about recognition and negotiation, but it does not preclude talks with informal contacts. But Carter took it, face value. We cannot talk to the PLO. And Carter would later admit that it's absolutely ridiculous what we pledged under Kissinger and Nixon, that we would not negotiate with the PLO, but our country's honor is at stake. So we have to adhere to this promise. We have to not talk to the PLO. This is important. It's stupid, but it's important. Right? So to sum up, before we move on to Carter, the preconditions for US peacemaking in the Arab-Israeli conflict was that talks would be between Israel and the Arab states, and secondly, that the PLO was a non-acceptable partner for negotiations. So could Carter break with these preconditions? Well, he certainly tried. When Carter became president of the United States, he immediately developed a so-called comprehensive approach. This comprehensive approach basically said, the opposite of Kissinger. It's not step by step. We cannot break it down to its individual parts. We have to solve the whole thing at once. Because if we don't solve it all at once, there's going to be basically a jealousy between the partners. They're going to, the ones that are not included will become spoilers. They will have an interest in derailing the peace. We have to include the Soviet Union, which is very radical in 1977, as a co-chair to the talks. So if we have both the Soviet Union and the United States guaranteeing for the peace, it's more stable. If the PLO is on board, Syria is on board, Egypt is on board, Jordan is on board, they're not going to basically take revenge for the other one having peace, but they'll sort of form this closed guarantee of the peace. Now, it's very important to understand that this was an extremely ambitious approach. It was unlikely that it was going to work. But that does not mean that it was naive. A lot of people have criticized Carter for being too naive. The point here is that they knew it was difficult, but they made the strategic analysis that if we don't do it this way, peace is going to be unstable. So it's a very sort of strategic analysis that it's the most secure way of getting a peace that's going to last. It's not about sort of a hippie type moment, right? And Carter's whole foreign policy team agreed that the Palestinians had a legitimate stake in the conflict, that the refugee issue had to be solved, and if it wasn't handled in that way, the PLO would remain a spoiler, and they would probably revert to terrorism or whatnot. But the Carter team was faced with this huge paradox. They both realized that it was the PLO that was the representative organization of the Palestinians, but they also insisted on sticking to Kissinger's promise of not talking to the PLO. So here's the conundrum. How do you have a peace which includes the PLO as a legitimate partner and as one of the most interested partners in the talks, but you cannot talk to them? And Carter was never going to be quite able to solve this conundrum, but it wasn't really for lack of trying, though he could have done more, but the point is he really tried. And in this context of U.S. Middle East diplomacy or understanding of the conflict, that in itself is a moment worth researching, because it is so unique and it was so important. So the idea was to do two things at the same time. The idea was to talk with all the other parties, except for the PLO, about trying to reach an agreement on what a comprehensive peace should look like. And they got pretty far. 1967 borders with modifications accepted through negotiations, that all fronts had to be tackled, that it had to be a full peace, not just a partial peace, so it had to imply recognition, etc., etc. That the Soviet Union would be co-chair to the conference, etc. So that's the one front. They're working on what the solution should look like. And the other front they're working on is to try to create a condition whereby the PLO can join the talks. And I'm going to look at the second approach a little bit here. Early on in his presidency, Carter made several public references to the need for a solution to the Palestinian issue. Now, these public statements served a twin purpose. For one, they warmed the US and Israeli public to the idea that Carter and his team were serious about the Palestinian issue and about including the Palestinians in the talks. The second point of these public declarations was to basically inform the PLO that, look, we're working towards the Palestinian issue, so if you can just do what you have to do, then we can talk to you. because we are really interested in solving the Palestinian issue. And the most famous such public declaration that appealed to the Palestinians and sort of warned Israel that this was on the agenda was the so-called Homeland speech. Now, the Homeland speech was not really a speech. The speech was about something completely different, but there was a questions and answers session, and somebody asked about the Middle East. And Carter made this very famous quote: "There has to be a homeland provided for the Palestinian refugees who have suffered for many, many years." Now, two things to note here. Homeland is a very vague term. It doesn't say state. And it's still refugees who are suffering. So it's still sort of a humanitarian issue. But Carter's advisors were completely shocked by this statement. Now, the ones that were the real Middle East experts in the team, they loved the statement. They were really happy that he made it, but they were shocked. He hadn't told them that he was going to say it. So they sort of had to adapt quickly. What does he mean with this? How are people going to react? The PLO said this is a welcome signal. And Arafat said that Carter had touched upon the core of the Middle East problem. So this was a recognition from the PLO that, we like what the US president is doing. This statement is very welcome. We have to try to figure out exactly what it means and where we can go from there, but they really liked it. Now, the Israel lobby, mainly represented by AIPAC, they launched a campaign against Carter because of the statement. And this is a very illustrating moment in Carter's presidency, because by making this statement, the PLO particularly, but the Arab states also in general, they really liked this new US trend. But the Israelis and much of the US public thought this was horrible. So here is the conundrum. How do you negotiate in a situation where everything you do that pleases one part really upsets the other? He was never really quite able to adapt to this. So I'm going to now split Carter's attempts into two. One is substance. What was he going to give the Palestinians? What was the solution he was proposing? And the other part is procedure. How do we get the PLO to join the talks? Now, these are very interrelated and they happen at the same time. Because like with the Homeland speech, the point was we're sending out signals, but at the same time we're negotiating with the Arab states and Israel about a solution. So they happen at the same time, but for analytical purposes, I'll separate them slightly. So the Homeland statement is very vague. And it does remind to a certain extent about the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which was used by the Zionists as the sort of founding, legitimizing argument of Israel later. But unlike the Balfour Declaration, it does not say national home. It just says homeland, which is even vaguer than national home. National home at least implies a sort of nationness about it, right? So we don't know exactly what was implied by homeland. It wasn't ever completely clarified. The point being that Carter and his advisors, they agreed that this is a negotiation process. So we cannot preclude a solution. We cannot say it has to become a state, or we cannot say it has to be an entity federated with Jordan. We cannot say exactly what the solution is. But we can look at some of the things Carter talked about that were part of US thinking at the time. And it was very clear that Israel would have to withdraw on all fronts. And on the West Bank, there could be minor mutually agreed modifications. But the point is that they had to be mutually agreed, which means not only Israel had to agree to it, but the Arab states and the Palestinians, when they got aboard, had to agree to it too. So there's a clear withdrawal element here. He was the first US president to say that Israeli settlements are not only a problem to peace, but that they are in fact illegal. Now, a lot of the American leaders had agreed to this, but they never said so publicly. Carter went full out and said they are illegal. He talked about a solution to the refugee problem, but it was still vague exactly how. There was no commitment to a Palestinian state, and he could accept a federation with Jordan. But most importantly, Carter was very clear that there had to be Israeli withdrawal and there had to be Palestinian sovereignty, which meant that the Palestinians had to take part in deciding what was an acceptable solution. So even though he didn't say state, one could, in a sense at least, assume that if the Palestinians had their say and there would be full Israeli withdrawal, well then state was certainly a possibility. So, you have the solutions on the one hand, but you still have the problem of approaching the most important representatives of that solution, the PLO. When Jimmy Carter came to power, he told Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin that we don't know any Palestinian leaders other than the PLO. We hope that you could accept such an arrangement. It would be a blow to US support for Israel if you refuse to participate in the Geneva talks over the technicality of the PLO being in the negotiations. So this is very clear. They want them to be part, and they consider it a blow to US-Israeli relations if Israel does not accept the PLO. But this is hugely paradoxical, because while he's pressuring Yitzhak Rabin to accept the PLO, he refuses to talk to the PLO himself. And not only does he refuse to talk to the PLO, he does not allow any of his diplomats to talk to the PLO. At one point, he even fires his UN ambassador for talking to the PLO. So Carter, there are a lot of paradoxes with Carter, but one of them is that he was a very strict adherent to Sinai too. The US had promised not to talk to the PLO. And he was very, very strict on that regard. But at the same time, he started bending the rules for how they could open talks to them. Now, the first thing he did, which was to bend the sort of set of US rules, was that instead of saying, we can talk to the PLO if it recognizes Resolution 242, Carter made it clear that once PLO recognizes 242, we will talk to them immediately. That doesn't say anything about what they would reach a conclusion on, if those talks would be good or fruitful or whether they would agree to anything. But if PLO recognized 242, they would talk immediately. And this is a huge difference. It has a promise of you will gain something by doing so. The other thing he did was basically to open back channels to allow for those talks to develop. And some of these back channels are on this PowerPoint. There were three types. Palestinian intellectuals, such as Edward Said, Walid Khalidi, Ibrahim Abu Lukhud. Then there was American individuals who knew the PLO, or knew Arafat in one way or another. The most famous was the Quaker Landrum Bowling. And the third such channel was states. Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and even the Soviet Union were used to talk to the PLO on behalf of Carter. The problem with this last channel was that they were not neutral interlocutors. Syria had a very clear interest in pushing the PLO in one direction. Egypt had an interest in pushing the PLO in another direction. Same with Saudi Arabia, and the same with the Soviet Union. But it is remarkable that in the middle of the Cold War, a US president is using the Soviet Union to talk to the PLO on behalf of the US president. This in itself is really remarkable. Now, ultimately, all these back channels failed. But let's take a closer look at how close they got. Because essentially, they were negotiating semantics. And if these two formulations became the same formulation, they would open talks immediately. The first is Arafat's formulation. Had Resolution 242 dealt with the Palestinian question as a cause of a people that has its national rights and aspirations to establish its state and its homeland, and not as a problem of refugees, the PLO would have accepted it. In other words, if da-da-da, then we would accept. The US formulation is the PLO accepts Resolution 242 with the reservation that it considers that the resolution does not make adequate reference to the question of Palestinians, since it fails to make any reference to a homeland for the Palestinian people. In other words, we accept it if it had been so and so. In the words of a Saudi diplomat, it was between PLO's negative refusal and the US's positive refusal. That's how close they were. And this was not the only example. There was, I think, a month or two later, they exchanged a new set of formulas, which were, I don't remember if slightly closer or slightly further apart, but I mean, in essence, they were changing the formulation to try to adapt to the other's position. The PLO refused to say we accept it, and then let's negotiate about its contents. And the US was basically saying, you have to accept it because that is the parameters, and we can negotiate its exact contents a little bit later. And that's how close they are. And at another time, Yasser Arafat told the Americans that he was prepared to accept Resolution 242 if the Americans were prepared to accept the possibility of a Palestinian state. Now, Carter never went that far because he said that is up for negotiation. So we cannot give you a promise before the negotiations. We can only promise that if you accept the parameters for the negotiations, then we can negotiate. And that was, from Arafat's point of view, that was asking too much for too much. Basically, he was going to get too little in return for a huge concession. And then, after this, everything fell apart. The whole thing basically collapsed. Because, well, a lot of things happened. Sadat went to Jerusalem, etc. So the Egyptian-Israeli talks was what took over. But the question remains, if we just stop to ponder this semantic moment. If the PLO had accepted the US formula, could there have been a situation where the US managed to get the PLO and Israel into the same negotiation? Well, by the time Menachem Begin takes over after the May election, certainly not. But in the early part of Carter's period, under the Labour government, well, they didn't completely say it's impossible. Here's a quote from Israeli Foreign Minister Yigal Allon in February 1977. Without its covenant and refraining from terrorism and recognizing the right of Israel to exist and recognizing the 242, the PLO ceases to be the PLO. When this tiger becomes a horse, let me know and I will think about riding it. So they don't want to ride it, but he'll think about it if they recognize 242. Since they never recognized 242, he didn't have to think about it, and anyway, he was out of government by that time. But let us look at the second statement, and this is Menachem Begin. This is signature Menachem Begin. Israel cannot, under any circumstance, withdraw to the lines of June 4, 1967. We will not agree, under any circumstance, that in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, a state should come into being called Palestinian. In other words, he implies that Palestinian is a false notion. And with regard to the Palestinian state, we have to realize that we are faced with the most cruel enemy of the Jewish people since the days of the Nazis. And this negation of Palestinian rights and the Nazi comparison was an obsession with Begin. He would do it over and over and over again. And if you read Begin's speeches, the Nazi analogy is there almost every time. I mean, that's the picture he was painting. So, faced with this Israeli stance, it's probably not going to happen anyway. And things shifted, and the peace process completely fell apart. But it was the comprehensive peace process that fell apart. And there was a moment there where instead Egypt, led by Anwar Sadat, and Menachem Begin start suggesting that let's go into a separate peace instead. And as things developed, basically the PLO is out. The other Arab states are furious with Sadat for doing this, etc., etc. And Carter realizes that the comprehensive approach is no longer possible. But he insists that he will not be the man to create a separate peace between Egypt and Israel. He will accept a separate peace between Egypt and Israel if it is agreed that that is a first step towards a broader peace. So the Palestinians never leave Carter's vision. They are the next phase, right? That's how it develops. And Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat both desperately want a bilateral peace. Sadat wants to become an ally of the U.S. He wants the Sinai back. He wants to have, this huge successful withdrawal. Begin wants to retain his alliance with the U.S. and he wants to split the Arab world. He wants Egypt out of the Arab alliance. So Begin knows that he has to provide something on the Palestinian issue, which has to be just enough so that Sadat can buy it, and just enough to convince Carter that it's possible to continue with the Palestinians after the peace with Egypt. And the notion he comes up with is self-rule. It's also called home rule or autonomy. And it is a rather bizarre concept. And I struggle to explain it, so just bear with me. Basically, it's a political construction that conceptually separates the physical land, the territory, from the people living on it. Okay? So Begin says that Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and Gaza, they are eternally Jewish territories. They are the Jewish homeland, Eretz Israel. We cannot give it up. So physically, it is ours for all eternity. But there are people living on it. He doesn't recognize them as Palestinians, but he recognizes they're Arabs living on Judea and Samaria. So, his idea is that the Arabs want sovereignty, and we want sovereignty. And our gift to them in negotiations is that we won't claim sovereignty. We won't make a claim to it. We won't annex it. It'll just sort of remain unsovereign territory. And the Palestinians, they can keep residing on it, but they can have no national rights. They can have individual rights. They can be people who have the right to sort of control everyday lives, culture, everyday things, but they have no territoriality about them. They have no nationality about them. They can have administrative rights. And his only real promise is that we won't claim sovereignty for 5 years. So for 5 years, the sovereignty of the territory will be in a limbo. Israel will continue to control the territory, but will just not claim it. And the follow-up of that is that the PLO will continue to be banned. The Administrative Council, which is what the Palestinians will get, cannot try to make a state. If they try to make a state, they will be arrested. And the U.S. rejects this. They consider it completely. It just doesn't work. It's a construction. I mean, there's no way a people will just accept having control of their personal lives, but not get a state and not be federated with Jordan or anything. I mean, they will just remain under Israeli occupation. But as everything else collapses, and Carter has been working almost non-stop on this conflict, he wants some success. So he basically reaches the conclusion, okay, this self-rule or home rule scheme, it can be a start. We can go from there to something more later. But if we get a peace between Egypt and Israel that says that for the beginning there will be home rule, and then afterwards we can move on, well, okay. But it was very important for Carter that it was a temporary solution, that it had to move on to something more later. So this illustrates again that Carter never left the Palestinian issue. And his top Middle East advisors, they basically said, had he been elected again, he would have pushed that really hard. But Begin managed to win through. And Carter at once told him bluntly, if I were an Arab, I would prefer the present Israeli occupation to this proposal of yours. So it's very clear. Carter didn't like it, but he came to accept it. Now what happened with Carter is basically a tragedy in terms of his running of the world. There was the hostage crisis in Iran, as I mentioned, all these crises. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. It was just, the world collapsed at the last years of Carter's presidency. And there was even another Democrat who tried to run against him in the election in the US. So he basically had no political capital to use at the end at all. And Begin didn't really want his own self-rule proposal. So once he'd gotten the peace, he basically slowed the whole negotiation to a stop. And Sadat was afraid that if he pushed too hard on the Palestinian issue, Begin would not withdraw from the Sinai. And, well, Sadat seemed not really to care about the Palestinian issue at all, particularly after the PLO had been furious with him about the separate peace. So home rule never became a reality, and what happens is you get the separate peace, and we all know what happens after that. It did not stop conflict in the Middle East, though it did certainly create peace between Egypt and Israel. So basically, to sum up the Carter period, it is a negotiation between Carter's idea of a comprehensive peace, including the Palestinians, and Begin's vision of peace with Egypt only, and this sort of, what should I call it, this construction of a Palestinian solution that will not result in anything. And Begin won. Carter was completely outmaneuvered by Begin. Begin was a brilliant politician. I mean, after having read all the negotiation talks, he seems like one of the worst people to negotiate with. He never moved an inch. And I think it's William Quandt, who was one of the advisors of Carter and later as one of the big researchers of U.S. diplomacy in the region, said that we would push and we would push and we would push against Begin, and when he finally moved an inch, we thought it was a foot. Right? He just stood his ground. And Sadat sort of, if we take face value what happened, he more or less pretended that he cared about the Palestinians. And in the end, what mattered to him was the Sinai. And looking at the talks, it would appear that Carter cared more about the Palestinian issue than Sadat. But he was not willing to make that last bend of the rules. He was not willing to say, listen, the pledge to not talk to the PLO was foolish. We have to open communications. He was not willing to say to Israel, you know what? I said settlements was illegal. You kept building settlements. Now I'm going to break my pledge. I'm going to talk to the PLO. He was never willing to let's say, take those hard measures. There's a lot of thinking of, if Israel continues like this, we will go public with a blame game. There was a lot of thinking of, let's get the Europeans on board, criticizing Israel, but he never took that step. So in a sense, he was a visionary, but he was a soft visionary. He had a lot of great ideas, but he never took the tough steps that were required to push them into fruition.